Hey, what's up, animation people? This is a quick little tutorial I wanted to record to teach you all about some software that can help you assemble and enhance your animations once you playlist or render them out of Maya. The main piece of software I'll be introducing is called Adobe Premiere. But first, I wanted to quickly introduce Handbrake, a free open source video converter. Sometimes people render or playlist AVI files from Maya, and these files are huge. Chances are you'll want to convert them to a smaller file type like MOV or MP4. Handbrake is a great program that lets you do this. Import a file, and the default settings will usually do you right. Just make sure you check your output location, hit start, and away it goes. Now on to Premiere. Premiere is a 2D video editing software that excels at taking images, videos, and audio from lots of different sources and assembling them all together into one video. What it's not good at is generating video itself. It's really built to take pre-existing, ready-to-go media generated elsewhere and arrange and combine them into a single video. That being said, don't worry, you're probably like, oh my god, I have to learn a whole nother piece of software, but Premiere is super simple. We're taking like a whole semester to learn 1% of Maya. It's going to take you one video to learn basically all the Premiere you need. Upon opening Premiere, you can create a new project. Projects are automatically saved in a special folder that Premiere creates in your Documents folder, but you can change this. Upon opening your project, notice the views at the top. Premiere's various functions are sorted away into all of these different views. For your purposes, you'll probably only need the editing view. Let's start with the basic case of using a video. Go to the bottom left corner that says Project. That's where all of your source media will live. Right-click to import, or use Control-I or Command-I and select a video file. Then, drag it onto the bottom right panel, the timeline. This will place that entire video on the timeline, creating a sequence that you can then play.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
A few things of note here. These two blue sliders both represent your current position in the sequence. You can click and drag either of them to adjust your current position. If I'm dragging my slider in the timeline and I hold Shift, then the slider will snap to the endpoints of whatever's in the timeline. To play, or to stop, just hit Space. Also, notice that the timeline down below goes on as long as you want it to, but the video itself up top only lasts until the end of the last thing on the timeline. This empty space on the end does not become part of the video. That being said, empty spaces before the last thing on the timeline do become part of the video. Also, notice that the sequence that was created has the same dimensions and frame rate as the first thing we put on it, although you can adjust these settings later in Sequence Settings. We can move this video left and right on the timeline, and we can also adjust its endpoints by grabbing them and dragging. We can also change how we view the timeline by using this slider on the bottom to move left and right and zoom in and out. Also, notice that this video is actually two things: the video itself and the associated audio. They live on different tracks, a video track on top and an audio track on the bottom. By default, Premiere keeps these in sync, but by right-clicking and selecting Unlink, you can move one without moving the other. Another way you can put a video on the timeline is by selecting just a snippet of the video. This is useful for particularly long videos that you need just a section from. It'll be really awkward to put the entire thing on the timeline and then trim the edges to just the small portion you need, so instead of dragging the whole thing to the timeline, we're going to drag this video to the source panel in the top left. From here, we can see the entire source, and by hitting the I and the O keys, we can select the start and the end of a section we'd like to import. Once the selection has been made, just click on the video itself and drag it to the timeline. Or we can click and drag these two icons here to grab just the video or just the audio. Note that here we've got two videos on the timeline, one after the other, on the same tracks. There's a gap of nothingness in the middle. If we'd like one to play immediately after the other, we need to move them immediately adjacent to each other in the timeline. When you do this, you'll get this funnel-looking icon, which will let you know that they're right up next to each other. Another way to get rid of this gap of nothingness in the middle is to simply click on it to select it and then hit backspace to delete it. Oftentimes, the result of a render isn't one video file, but rather a bunch of images, one image per frame. Premiere is actually smart enough to interpret these images as one continuous video file as long as the images are named sequentially like this. Just select the first image in your sequence, head to the options, and check Image Sequence. Then, the source that you import will be just the same as any other video, although notice there's no audio, so only one video track shows up. Also, you can import images and sound files as well. When imported, they'll show up in the timeline as just a video track or just an audio track. Sometimes you might also want to have just an image of a solid color. For this, you can create a color matte. To do this, right-click on an empty space within your project panel, and under New Item, select Color Matte. Click through the window, select your color, and the color then becomes a resource that you can drag onto the timeline just like anything else. Another very useful operation is the razor. You can find your razor tool in the toolbox right here, and cutting something in the timeline using the razor tool turns it from one thing into two segments, each of which you can manipulate independently. Let's return now to this notion of tracks. You might have noticed that we have other tracks on top and on the bottom of the one video and audio track that we've already been using. So let's see what happens when we add something on top of another.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
You'll notice that, video-wise, whatever's on top shows up on top, while audio-wise, if two things overlap, both of them play at the same time. The reason that in this demo the top video is smaller than the bottom video is that the top video is only 360p and the bottom video is HD, so the top video is physically smaller than the bottom one. If your top video is physically the same size or bigger than the bottom one, it'll cover up the bottom video completely, which could be a good thing if you want that to happen. By the way, selecting which track you're dragging onto in Premiere is really weird. If it doesn't let you do what you want to do, you might need to activate the track or select the track as a target by clicking on these numbers on the left, or sometimes deactivate other tracks. Just toggle these until you get the behavior that you want. Additionally, you'll notice that you can still line things up directly one after the other, even if they're on different tracks. The same icon will still show up. This layering behavior with the tracks is particularly useful for rendered image sequences or other things with transparent backgrounds. So for example, I've rendered just this one text object without anything behind it in my Maya scene, and that, when rendered, turned into images that have transparent backgrounds. That means that I can put this image sequence on top of this video, and the video will show up underneath. Layering together all the things we've learned so far, we can make this. A word of warning is that now that we know how to move things onto different tracks, be careful when you're putting something onto a track that already has something on it. If you drag something onto a track at a time when something else already exists, the new thing will override the old thing, deleting some or all of it.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
Two more quick things about selection. If you want to select multiple things on a timeline, you can hold Shift and click. Or, by starting a click on an empty part of the timeline and dragging, you can drag out a rectangle to select everything inside. Now that we know about placing things onto a timeline, let's have some fun with manipulating them. Let's select something on the timeline and then head to Effect Controls in the top left. Here we can see some options for manipulating the video and the audio. Under Motion in the Video section, we can see controls for manipulating the video's translation, rotation, and scale, and in a separate section, we can control its opacity. This can be very powerful when combined with keyframes. To enable keyframing for any particular property, hit the stopwatch next to its name. This will automatically create a keyframe at the current time with the current values. Also, notice that by default, keyframing is on for opacity, although there are no keyframes yet. Adjusting opacity, though, will create keyframes automatically, so if you'd like to adjust the opacity over the entire clip without keyframes, make sure to turn the keyframes off. However, if you'd like to add keyframes to a property, head to the time you'd like to keyframe and simply change the value. Upon doing this, a keyframe will be automatically created. To change that keyframe's value further, I need to place my slider exactly on it, which will make this center button turn blue to indicate that I'm on a keyframe. Adjusting these values only affects existing keyframes if my slider is exactly on a keyframe. Otherwise, adjusting a value will instead create a new keyframe at the time the slider's at. To help me get exactly on existing keyframes, I can use these buttons to jump to the previous or next keyframe for a given property. I can also hit the center button to create a new keyframe that has the current value for that property. In the timeline to the right, you can also move the keyframes forward and backwards in time by clicking and dragging them. Also, something to watch out for is that it's possible to move your time slider out of the range of your selected clip using the global timeline on the bottom. If this happens and you adjust a property of a clip that you're not currently viewing because your time slider isn't within the clip's bounds, then you won't see your changes until you put your time slider back within the clip's bounds. The audio section also has a volume control. It's called level. This level control only goes up so loud though. If you have a particularly quiet piece of audio or a particularly loud one, you can turn the volume up or down as much as you want throughout the whole audio clip by right-clicking it and adjusting the audio gain. Audio gain can't be keyframed though, but level can. So use audio gain to set the audio clip's base volume to something reasonable, and then use level to keyframe and fine-tune. There's also the text tool. You'll find it in your toolbox and it creates a text object in your timeline. In the same Effect Controls panel, you'll find options to select the font and the color. There's also an option called Stroke, which adds an outline to your text. Be careful, if you want to change these, you'll have to have the text itself selected, much like a text editor like Microsoft Word. There are also lots of fun effects you can play around with in Premiere. To see what's available, go to Effects in the bottom left panel. Then, drag an effect into the Effect Control panel while a clip is selected. And that's it, the effect is now applied. Most effects also have lots of internal controls that you can play around with to fine-tune or to keyframe. By right-clicking on something in the timeline, there are two other controls that you might find useful: speed duration and frame hold. Speed duration allows you to adjust the speed of a clip as well as reverse it. And then frame hold allows you to freeze a video at a certain point. If I add a frame hold here, partway through this video, then it'll chop the video in two and replace the second half of the video with just a still image of that frame.
Seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
Notice though that the audio stays intact and attached to the first half of the video. Adjusting your playback speed and using frame holds, combined with the razor tool, can be an easy way to play around with the timing of your animation without having to adjust keyframes in Maya, which can be pretty frustrating. Lastly, I'll share something about keying. Say you can only play blast instead of rendering, but you still want to use Premiere to put a background under an object. Play blasting can't produce anything with a transparent background, but if this is the case, dig around in your Maya settings to put the play blast on a bright green background, or some color that contrasts cleanly with all of your objects.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
Then, Playblast. Put the resulting playblast on your timeline and select the color key effect under keying. In the options for the color key effect, select your background color by clicking the eyedropper and then clicking on a pixel of the background color that you want to remove. Premiere will then look for pixels of this color and remove them. Then, bring up your color tolerance until the background is removed but none of the actual object is removed. You'll notice that there's a thin jagged line of background around the object, though. This is anti-aliasing. Basically, to make the image easier on the eye, Maya takes the edges of all of its objects and fuzzes them out slightly to avoid jaggedy, pixelated edges. It looks great visually, but color keying struggles with this because those edges are filled with pixels that are kind of half object, half background. To fix this, just chop the outer pixels out. Use the edge thin to chop out a certain number of pixels around the edges. Usually 1 is enough if your color tolerance is high enough. And then re-fuzz out the edges using a little bit of feathering. I usually go with like a 0.5 or something low. Play around with the numbers and find out what looks best. This won't be perfect, but it'll be close enough.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
However, this only works well for things that have sharp, defined edges. If you've used effects like smoke or fire in Maya, then this won't work, since the fuzzed out edges of those effects will have a lot of pixels that are half background, half foreground. If this is what you've done in Maya, this color-keyed playblasting technique won't quite work. You may have to render, which will give you a transparent background and partial transparency for things that need it. Another way is to add your effects later outside of Maya, in Premiere. Just find some stock effects footage, there's plenty on YouTube. Download, import, place on top of your video, and crucially, in the effect controls under opacity, set your blend mode to linear dodge add. This takes the pixels of your video and adds them to the pixels underneath, in the sense of light addition. Red plus blue plus green equals white, that kind of light addition. Because the background is black, that's adding no light to what's underneath, so it just leaves the effect behind, perfectly blended into the video below.
Tomara que a Júlia seja muito feliz com a escolha dela.
This is great for smoke, fire, sparkles, magic spells, anything that's got those fadey or glowy kind of edges. Lastly, we'll export. Go to File, Export, Export Media, set the file type. If you want an MP4, it's actually called H264 here. To change the location that the final file gets sent to, set that in Output Name. Then just hit Export and let her rip. And there, that's just about all you need to know in Premiere. I think you'll find it a lot simpler to use in any 3D animation software, hopefully, and I think you'll find it a lot of fun, too. I hope this helps you think about how you can take simple renders and assets and combine them into something really cool.